There are moments you replay without meaning to. Not the dramatic ones, not the arguments or the grand gestures, the quiet ones. The ones where someone looked at you a half second longer than necessary and you felt it somewhere you weren't prepared for. That's where we left off. And if you've been thinking about what happens next, you're not alone. Welcome back. Before we continue, if you're new here, subscribe, because this channel is built on stories like this one, and your support is what keeps them coming. Leave a like if you're already invested, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. It genuinely matters. Now, Marlo didn't sleep. Cade didn't pretend that ride home was just a ride home. And the gallery, the letters, the careful professional distance they'd both been maintaining, all of it is about to get a lot harder to hold on to. Part 2 starts now. Let's go. I told myself the morning would reset things, that whatever had passed between us in that car would dissolve in the ordinary light of a workday, the way these things usually do when you give them enough air and distance. It didn't. If anything, the next few days had a different quality to them, a new kind of awareness that sat just below the surface of every normal interaction. He was still professional. I was still professional. But there was something that hadn't been there before, something that made the air between us feel slightly thinner, like we were both breathing a little more carefully. The police called on Friday with an update that wasn't really an update. They had no leads on the letters, the fingerprint analysis had come back clean, and they were essentially suggesting we wait and see if another one arrived. I thanked them, hung up, and sat with the specific frustration of being told to be patient about something that felt deeply personal. Cade was leaning against the doorframe of my office when I looked up. He'd heard enough. "We're not waiting," he said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. I appreciated that more than I probably should have. He'd spent the previous week quietly cross-referencing the gallery's vendor list, past employees, and anyone who'd had access to the building in the last 6 months. That afternoon, he spread everything across the small conference table and walked me through it, and I sat across from him and tried to focus on the documents instead of the way he moved through information. Methodical, unhurried. Like a man who'd learned a long time ago that rushing led to missing things. We were an hour in when I found something. A name on the vendor list that I recognized. Not well, but enough. A man who'd done lighting installation work the previous spring and who'd been let go after a disagreement with our facilities manager. I'd forgotten about it entirely, but seeing his name brought back a conversation I'd overheard. Something about him feeling passed over, overlooked, dismissed. Cade went still when I told him. "You're sure it's the same person?" "Pretty sure. I remember his face. He was here for almost 3 weeks." He wrote the name down and looked at it for a moment, then at me. "You did good," he said. I laughed slightly, surprising myself. I remembered a face. It's not exactly detective work. You'd be surprised how many people don't. He was looking at me with that expression again, the one that wasn't quite neutral anymore, that had something warmer moving underneath it. I held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. The table between us suddenly felt both appropriate and insufficient. I looked down at the documents first this time. He let me, but when I reached across the table to pull one of the folders toward me, his hand was resting near the edge, and my fingers brushed his. And neither of us moved for just a moment. A moment so brief, it was almost deniable. Almost. When I looked up, he was still watching me, and what I saw in his face wasn't surprise. It was something that looked a great deal like restraint. The lead on the former vendor didn't resolve anything overnight, but it gave the investigation a direction it hadn't had before, and that alone changed the atmosphere in the gallery in a way I hadn't anticipated. The staff seemed lighter. I seemed lighter. And Cade seemed more focused, which shouldn't have been attractive, but was, in the specific way that competence always is, when you've spent enough time around people who perform it without actually possessing it. We spent the following week working late into the night, the gallery quiet and cavernous around us as we cross-referenced schedules. One evening, as the rain streaked against the office window, I found myself talking to him about the upcoming fundraiser gala, how I hated the performance of it, the way people looked at the art without really seeing it. He listened in that complete, slightly unnerving way that made me feel like he was memorizing my voice. I mentioned I was thinking of wearing something bold, maybe red, to feel more in control. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, his amber eyes tracking the movement of my hands as I organized the files. And for a second, I thought he was going to say something that had nothing to do with security. The physical distance between us felt thinner than it had ever been. He stood up to leave, pausing at the door, and told me that it didn't matter what color I wore. He wouldn't be losing sight of me for a second. The way he said it made my breath hitch. He wasn't just talking about the job anymore, and we both knew it. By the time the night of the gala actually arrived, my decision had shifted. I didn't want to be bold and loud. I wanted to be something else. So I reached for the dark green dress I'd bought on impulse months ago, wondering if he would notice the change. The lead on the vendor took 2 days to play out. Cade passed the name to a contact he had at a private investigations firm, someone he trusted more than the police's current level of engagement with our case. And by Saturday morning, there was enough circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction that the insurance company agreed to escalate. It wasn't resolved, not yet, but it had a shape now, a direction, and that alone made the air in the gallery feel slightly less loaded. What it didn't do was change anything between us. If anything, the reduced urgency made space for something else entirely. The gala had been on the calendar for weeks, a fundraiser for a contemporary arts foundation, the kind of event I attended every year out of obligation and left as early as professionally acceptable. I'd almost canceled, given everything, but the foundation's director was a woman who had supported my career in ways I hadn't forgotten. And showing up mattered. Cade was coming as my escort. That was the word my assistant used when she confirmed the arrangements, and I made the mistake of saying it out loud to him, which produced exactly 1 second of something flickering behind his eyes before he said, "Fine," and went back to reviewing the venue's floor plan. I told myself it meant nothing. I believed myself for approximately 40 minutes. The night of the gala, I came downstairs in a dress I'd bought on impulse the previous winter and never worn. Dark green, simple, the kind of thing that doesn't ask for attention but tends to get it anyway. Cade was waiting in the lobby. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him in a way that suggested it hadn't come off a rack, and he was looking at his phone when I stepped out of the elevator. He looked up. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked, with that complete, unhurried attention that I felt move over me like something physical. Then he said quietly, "You look beautiful." Not a line, not performed. Just a fact, stated plainly, the way he said everything. I said thank you, and we went out to the car, and I spent the entire ride reminding myself what this was. The gala was everything those events always are. Beautiful room, important people, conversations that require smiling while your feet hurt. Cade stayed close without crowding me, read the room the way he always did, and let me work. At some point in the evening, a man named Philip, who I'd met twice and who apparently felt we were closer than we were, inserted himself into my space with the specific confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a way that stuck. He was charming, persistent, and had his hand on my arm before I'd decided how to handle it. I didn't need to decide. I felt Cade beside me before I saw him, that familiar shift in the air, and when Philip glanced over and registered his expression, Something in the other man's posture recalibrated immediately. Philip excused himself within 30 seconds. I turned to look at Cade. He wasn't looking at Philip's retreating back. He was looking at me. And the expression on his face was not professional. It wasn't even close. I didn't address it at the gala. There were too many people, too much noise, too many reasons to keep things exactly where they were supposed to be. But on the ride home, the silence had a different weight to it. And I sat with my hands in my lap and watched the city lights move past the window, and tried to decide what I actually wanted to do with everything I was feeling. He walked me to my building. He hadn't done that before. Usually he waited at the car, and I noticed but didn't comment on it. We stood in front of the entrance for a moment, the cold air sharp and still around us, the street quieter than New York usually allowed itself to be at that hour. I turned to say goodnight, and he was closer than I expected. Not inappropriately close, just close enough that I had to adjust my awareness of him, which at this point required almost no adjustment at all, because I was always aware of him. Every degree of distance, every shift in his posture. "Cade," I said, not a question, not a prompt, just his name, because it was all I had. "I know," he said. And that was the thing about him that kept undoing me. He always seemed to know. Not in an arrogant way, not in the way of men who assumed. In the way of someone who paid attention when most people didn't bother. I looked up at him and made a decision that I'd probably been moving toward for weeks without admitting it. "Do you want to come up?" The question landed between us and stayed there. I watched something move through his expression. Not surprise, but something careful, something that was weighing itself. He was quiet for long enough that I started to reconstruct my composure around the edges of the silence. Then he said, "Yes." My apartment felt different with him in it. Smaller, warmer, more present. I took off my coat, and he stood near the window the way he always stood near windows, like exits were a reflex. And I poured 2 glasses of wine that I needed more for something to do with my hands than anything else. We sat on opposite ends of the couch and talked. Actually talked. In a way we hadn't before, without the structure of work around it. He told me about the army in the clipped, selective way of someone who's learned which parts to share. I told him about the gallery before it was successful, about the years of uncertainty, about how I'd learned to read a room because I'd had to. At some point, the space between us on the couch had decreased without either of us making a deliberate move, the way distance tends to collapse when no one's actively maintaining it. His arm was along the back of the cushion behind me, not touching, almost. I turned to say something and found his face closer than I'd calculated, and the sentence I'd been forming dissolved completely. His eyes moved to my mouth, just once, just briefly, but I saw it. And when they came back up to meet mine, the restraint I'd watched him carry for weeks was still there, but thinner now, and we both knew it. He said my name first, low and quiet, the way he said everything, but with something underneath it that I hadn't heard before, something that had given up pretending. I didn't answer. I didn't look away either. And then he reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from my face. Just one slow, deliberate motion, his fingers barely grazing my cheek. And that small, careful touch, after weeks of careful distance, did something to me that I couldn't have prepared for. I closed the space between us. He met me there. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined it, which is to say, it was quieter and more certain, and far more devastating than anything I could have constructed in my own head. He kissed me the way he did everything, with complete attention, no rushing, like there was nothing else in the world requiring his focus. One hand came up to the side of my face, and I felt the warmth of it against my jaw. And I stopped thinking about anything at all for a while, which was its own kind of relief. We stayed like that for a long moment. When we finally separated, he didn't move far, just enough to look at me, his hand still at my jaw, his thumb tracing one slow line along my cheekbone. I could feel my own pulse. "I've been wanting to do that," he said, "for a while." "I know," I said, which made the corner of his mouth move in that almost smile I'd catalogued weeks ago and thought about more than I'd admitted. We stayed up too late, talking mostly, in that new register that had opened up between us, closer than before, the evening unwinding in a way that felt earned rather than rushed. At some point, I fell asleep against his shoulder on the couch, which I didn't intend and couldn't bring myself to regret. And when I woke up, the room was dark and quiet, and he was still there, awake, one hand resting warm and steady at my shoulder. He left around 2 a.m. I walked him to the door, and he kissed me again, briefly, with one hand braced against the doorframe above my head. And I stood in my doorway for a moment after he was gone, feeling like someone had rearranged the furniture in a room I'd been navigating by memory. The next morning I went to the gallery, and he was already there, same as always, steady and present. He looked at me across the room, and something passed between us, warm and uncomplicated and entirely new. I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I might actually be okay. That thought lasted until noon, when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression I'd learned to associate with unwelcome information. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He says it's personal." I came out of my office and stopped. Marcus was standing in the entrance of my gallery, looking like he expected to disrupt my day. Behind him, Cade had gone completely still. A year ago, this would have ruined my week. Now, looking at Marcus, I felt nothing. I told him whatever he wanted to say would have to go through my lawyer, and asked him to leave before I had security escort him out. He blinked, shocked, and walked out without a word. I turned around. Cade was leaning against the wall, that familiar, almost smile playing on his mouth. But the quiet didn't last. The agency called Cade on a Thursday. I didn't know that at the time. I only knew that he was quieter than usual that afternoon. The kind of quiet that had a specific texture to it, different from his ordinary stillness. I noticed but didn't push. I'd learned that about him, that he needed space to arrive at things on his own terms, and that pushing only made him retreat further into that careful, professional composure that I'd spent weeks learning to see behind. He finished his shift, said goodnight, and left. Friday was normal. Saturday I spent at the gallery catching up on things I'd let slide during the chaos of the past few weeks. And he wasn't there because it was the weekend, and there was no longer a credible active threat. The former vendor had been identified, confronted with the evidence, and had backed down with the particular speed of someone who'd expected to remain anonymous. The letters had stopped. The case wasn't entirely closed, but the urgency was gone. And with the urgency gone, I became aware of a new and uncomfortable question taking up space in my mind. What happened now? Sunday evening, he texted me. Not a long message, just, "Can I come by?" I said yes and spent 20 minutes pretending I wasn't doing anything in particular, while actually changing my shirt twice and rearranging nothing on my kitchen counter. He arrived with coffee from the place 2 blocks away that I'd mentioned once, weeks ago, in passing. That he'd remembered was the kind of detail that got to me more than grand gestures ever had. We sat at my kitchen table, which felt more honest than the couch somehow, and he wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at me with that directness I'd stopped trying to deflect. "The agency knows," he said, "about us. Someone saw something at the gala, made a report. They want me off the account." I held his gaze. "Okay. I wanted you to hear it from me." "I appreciate that." He nodded slowly. Then, "I also want you to know that it doesn't change what I want, which is this, whatever this is. I'm not walking away from it because it's inconvenient." There was nothing rehearsed about the way he said it. No performance, no careful construction. Just a man sitting at a kitchen table telling the truth because he'd decided to. I thought about all the ways I'd protected myself over the past 2 years. All the distance I'd maintained. All the small refusals I'd dressed up as self-preservation. And then I thought about the last several weeks. The way he'd shown up consistently. The way he'd seen me clearly and stayed anyway. The way everything between us had been built slowly and honestly, without either of us forcing it. "I'm not walking away either," I said. Something in his shoulders released. It was subtle, just a fraction of tension leaving his frame. But I saw it because I always saw everything about him now. He reached across the table and took my hand, and I turned my palm up to meet his without hesitating. We stayed like that for a moment, just quiet, the Sunday evening settling around us. Then he stood and came around the table, and I stood too. And he kissed me the way he had that first time. Unhurried and certain, one hand at my jaw, the other finding my waist and drawing me in with a gentleness that had nothing fragile about it. I kissed him back and thought, clearly and simply, that this was what it felt like when something was actually right. Not perfect, not without complication or history, or the ordinary weight of two real people figuring something out. Just right. When we finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, and I closed my eyes and listened to the city outside my window, doing what it always did, loud and indifferent and ongoing, while everything inside that kitchen stayed exactly, quietly, still. I didn't know what came next, neither did he. But for the first time in a long time, not knowing felt like the beginning of something, rather than the absence of it. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means everything. Now I want to know, how would you rate this one from 1 to 10? Drop your number in the comments and tell me what you felt. Your support is what makes these stories possible, and I'm so grateful for every single one of you who listened all the way through. Until next time.